In this video on fire detection, fire and overheat detection and protection, we'll look at where extinguishing systems are installed for cargo compartments and other various areas on the aircraft besides the engines. So for most cargo compartments, especially those that are on passenger aircraft, we are going to want to be able to fight a fire in a compartment that's essentially non-accessible to the crew. So cargo fire bottles are installed. These different types of cargo compartments are classified as have different classifications, and these classes can be found in 14 CFR 25 857 if you want to read the full regulations. But kind of a summary here is these cargo fire bottles are used in Class C and F cargo compartments. These work in conjunction. We have fire or smoke detection systems, and then once that's been detected, then we need to put it out. But just to give you a quick overview of all the different cargo compartment classes, so the first is Class A, and this says presence of a fire would be easily discovered by a crew member while at their station, and each part of the compartment is easily accessible in flight. An example of this is something like an overhead bin. If there's a fire in an overhead bin, the cabin crew would be able to see the presence of smoke, see it, and be able to access it using a fire extinguisher. The next type is Class B, and these now have a fire or smoke detection system. So whereas something that, Class A does not have any kind of detection. So Class B adds fire and smoke detection, and in this case, the crew standing at a point can extinguish the fire in the compartment without entering. And so oftentimes they have fire and smoke detection. They don't have a built-in cargo fire extinguishing system, but maybe there is a tube or hose or duct running from the flight deck that a flight crew member can stick essentially the outlet of a fire extinguisher into and discharge agent into this enclosed compartment. They also are sealed off from the passenger and crew compartment, so there's a means to prevent the smoke and flames from entering those areas. But the big key here is there is no built-in fire extinguishing system. It relies on the crew being able to extinguish it by being able to get extinguishing agent in there somehow. The next classification, Class C, is probably what we have most common on passenger aircraft. So these have smoke and fire detection. This is the first one to use a built-in fire extinguishing system. And then they have a means to prevent smoke and flames from entering the passenger and crew compartment. And what this means is normally Class C cargo compartments do have ventilation. It's not uncommon to carry animals like people's pets down here. And also with luggage and stuff like that, people have things in there that we don't want to freeze or get too hot. And so conditioned air is able to go in here. They have pack air. But if there is smoke or flames in there, if there's a fire or smoke detected, we don't want those to be able to spread up into the passenger cabin or crew compartment, the flight deck. And so typically those have some kind of valves that can shut this area off. So we have that means to shut off airflow into the compartment. The other part of that is by being able to shut off airflow, that allows the built-in fire extinguishing systems that use oxygen displacing gases to work, because then they can flood that compartment and prevent, you don't want to flood the compartment and then just have airflow into it, re-flood it again with air that contains oxygen and can support combustion. So your Class C is your most common on your passenger aircraft, the underfloor. Next one that we have is called a Class E. You'll notice we skipped Class D. There is no Class D. But cargo compartment Class E, these are dedicated cargo aircraft, so you won't find these on passenger. These have fire and smoke detection. They do have a means to shut off airflow to the compartment, to the flight deck, essentially, the operator compartment. Means to prevent smoke and flames from entering that crew compartment. And the crew can access emergency exits no matter how cargo is loaded. People kind of wonder with this. The one I believe that falls into this category is like the freighter 747s where the nose can open. So the crew is on the upper deck of those. The flight deck in a 747 is accessed from the upper deck. There are emergency exits up there that the crew can get out of. And so the main deck below that, that's accessed by swinging open the nose for large cargo, is able to, uh, has the ability to check or sense fire and smoke and seal it off from the rest of the aircraft. And then the last different type is our Class F, and these are used oftentimes on conversion type aircraft, so converted to cargo. But these are where the cargo compartment is the main deck of the aircraft, where it is typically behind the flight deck. And so in this case, the main deck is the cargo compartment, and it's going to have fire and smoke detection, and there needs to be a means for the crew to extinguish or to control the fire without the crew entering that compartment. That may be like, again, the tubes that they can stick a large fire extinguisher into that discharges into various areas of that deck. But then it also has to be able to seal off from the crew compartment. So it means to prevent smoke and flames from entering crew compartments. So these classifications, kind of looking at them, again, C and F are the two that have extinguishing systems where the crew doesn't have to enter the compartment built in. And so when we look at those fire extinguishing bottles, they're very similar to what we had above or previously for engines and APU. Cargo fire bottles, when they're installed, they are there's always going to be at least 2 bottles, and on larger aircraft, there's typically more than that. So cargo fire bottles, they're a single discharge. Usually you have one set of cargo fire bottles that can be shared between multiple cargo compartments. On most transport aircraft that have underfloor cargo, there's a cargo compartment. You can see it in this diagram. There's a cargo compartment in front of the wing, and then a second one behind the wing box. Remember, this area, the area in the middle, contains the wing box, the main structure for the wings, as well as the landing gear. So you have a forward and aft cargo compartment. In that case, we would have one set of fire bottles, one set of extinguishing bottles that could be discharged to either end of either the front or the aft cargo compartment. The likelihood of multiple cargo compartments, again, isolated cargo compartments, is low, so that's why we only need one set of extinguishers. But these 2 bottles, there's always going to be at least 2 because they're going to be at least 2 different types. So they are activated simultaneously when the crew discharges them. Both fire bottles or both extinguishing bottles or both types of extinguishing bottles activate at the same time. And what happens is one of those bottles is known as a high rate discharge bottle. So in this example, where we have 7 bottles, the first 2 here are high rate discharge. These, as soon as they're activated, they dump their full contents, they empty their full contents into that cargo compartment. The idea there is that we want to put the fire out, initially snuff it out, fill the space with halon, push out any oxygen that's in there, and get that fire to be put out. So they quickly discharge and put out the fire. But because the aircraft has to be able to continue to fly until it can get somewhere on the ground to deal with this cargo fire, we need to have a minimum of 180 minutes of effectiveness going forward. And so what would happen is that initial that initial discharge of extinguishing agent could potentially dissipate and no longer fill the compartment. We don't want it to be hot somewhere and reignite. And so the rest of these bottles, or the second bottle or more on a larger aircraft, are going to be a low rate discharge. These are going to discharge over time. And so those metered slow discharging bottles are going to make sure that that compartment stays filled with the inert gas and that oxygen can't make its way back in. And those, again, have a minimum effectiveness of 180 minutes so that that airplane has time to find a landing site and get on the ground. When they're installed, they're typically installed under the floor, oftentimes along inside the wall of the cargo compartment, like shown in this little inset here. And then This one, for instance, they are in the front, and it shows the two high discharge bottles and the metered bottles, and then there are tubes, pipes to be able to discharge them into the front compartment right here. There's a little line coming off into this front compartment, or it can be routed back to the aft compartment. And that is selected by, again, having an arm switch. So you can see here there's an arm switch for the forward compartment. There's a separate arm switch for the aft compartment. So whichever compartment has a fire in it, that's going to be the one that lights up. So if we have a fire in our forward compartment, this forward armed light will light up. We would push the forward arm button, and then to actually discharge the fire suppression bottles, you would push the discharge, and that's going to go into whichever armed, it's going to go into whichever compartment was armed in the previous step. Here's a little closer look at those high rate and low rate discharge. You can see here these, some aircraft, this type there's a regulator right here. So actually in this case, these bottles are basically all the same. It's just this regulator slows the flow of inert gas, slows the flow of extinguishing agent from bottles C, D, E, F, and G, whereas bottles A and B, they're allowed to go directly in. And so the direction it's going to go, there is the forward flow valve here, aft flow valve here. Whichever valve, those valves are opened by the push switches for the arm. So when I push that forward arm button, that would open the forward valve. And then when I push the discharge button, the discharge button will activate all the squibs simultaneously, which means that the first two bottles will initially discharge into the forward, and then over time the rest of the bottles will slowly continue to discharge into the forward to keep that chamber filled with inert gas. Other areas where you have fire extinguishing, I've talked about APU. There's typically one single fast flow bottle that's designed to fill the APU enclosure and snuff out whatever type of fire is taking place there. Just like the engines and the cargo, but just like the engines, when the crew presses the APU arm button, that closes fuel valves and air valves going into the APU enclosure. So it creates that sealed fire zone space in preparation for discharging the extinguishing agent into there. And so hopefully it can't reignite because we've cut off our fuel source. So we discharge into that sealed or enclosed APU compartment, and there may be, it's usually either two switches, an arm and a discharge, or a pull and turn with the T handles. The other area I've talked about having a fire bottle is in the lavatory, and specifically the lavatory waste bin, because that's the one area where the crew in the cabin can't monitor. This is a very small halon bottle, usually the size of a fist or a softball. And so you have a little halon bottle here. You can see there's no pressure gauge or anything on it. It has a couple little tubes coming off the bottom. These are the discharge tubes. They're pointed into the trash can. And at the end of these tubes, the tips of them, they contain a solder plug. The solder plug that's in the tips is a metal solder that melts at whatever temperature we want them to activate. And so it's a pressurized bottle. Excuse me. The extinguishing agent is held in by the fact that the tubes are blocked with a solder plug. If a fire does occur, the heat from it melts the solder plugs. When they melt, then the extinguishing agent is able to escape through the tubes. And so it releases into there. To know if this system has been activated, there's a couple ways. One, oftentimes we can see the solder in the tips of these. But inside our waste bin area, let me get this out of the way. Inside of our waste bin area, there's going to be a temperature witness strip, and there's kind of an example shown here. So this little temperature indicator strip will be stuck to the side of the trash can or inside the door. And essentially the way it works, it has different colored dots that turn brown at different temperatures. So if a fire occurs, if it gets up to 180 degrees, let's see if I can get the right color here. If it gets up to, say, about 180 degrees, that looks close enough to dark brown, this dot will turn dark brown color. If it gets above 200 degrees, this one will discolor to dark brown or almost a black. If it gets above 230 degrees, this one will turn dark brown or black. And if it gets above 250, this one will turn dark brown or black. And so that's what we would look for when we would check. First thing we'd look for is see, is the indicator strip, have any of the dots been turned dark brown? If not, if they still have all their colors present, then we know it hasn't gotten hot in there, and in all likelihood, the extinguishing bottle has not been discharged. But we could also inspect the tips of the extinguishing bottle, and you can kind of see the solder plugs down here. So you can always check the tips. And then the ultimate way to know if one of these has been discharged or not is you remove it, undo the couple screws holding it in, and you take it over, and on them, somewhere on the label, will be printed the weight. It'll have the total weight right here. So you can see this one has a total weight, and so if it's been activated, it will no longer be that total weight. That total weight is the weight of the bottle plus the charge inside of it. And so we could inspect them a few different ways. We would have to pull these out regularly. We would weigh them to make sure that they weren't leaking. And then usually if they were and they were within their lifespan, we would be able to reinstall them in the aircraft. So that wraps up fire, overheat, and smoke protection and extinguishing.